Okay, we're now recording. As always, we love seeing your faces, right? Your faces and reactions are what help our facilitators respond in real time to what is most interesting to you. So if you feel comfortable, turn off your camera, or turn on your camera, turn it on. But if you don't, we completely understand. And we also know that many of you are taking your calls from home. So your kids, creatures, podmates, or housemates are of course welcome. And then as always, have something to take your notes so you can process your thoughts later. And let's get into it. So, as always, I like to start our sessions with an invitation to each person attending. Today, we invite you to listen deeply. We invite you to embrace and notice discomfort and tension. Ask yourself, where is the discomfort sitting in? Take care of yourself within that. If you need water, if you need to get up and move and stretch and feel your body, that's okay too. Don't be afraid to take risks, ask questions, be vulnerable. These systems of injustice weren't built in a day, and we're not going to be able to dismantle them in one. And so do not let the perfect be the enemy of the good. And finally, hold each other with compassion. We know, as I said earlier, social justice work is a practice. And so we are all learning daily, and we are all going to make mistakes. And it's not to say that if you make a mistake, you write it off, but it is to say that when somebody offers feedback, you embrace it, take a couple deep breaths, and work to be better. So with that, next slide. Okay, before I let Kyson dive in and before I let Haley dive in, I just want to share, Kyson was my former colleague at Philanthropy Together, and Z has gone off on their own to make their own consulting group, leaving me in tears, but also so much pride. Kyson truly is what I would call a spirit sibling for me. I feel so grateful to have worked alongside Zim throughout all of that. And I'm so excited to bring Kyson here today to all of you to really share Ziz's expertise. And Haley is also an amazing organizer, organization founder, like carries themselves with wisdom beyond their years, has such a passion for this work. And I know that all of you will leave a little bit more ignited and a little bit more energized because you'll just see Haley's passion and know I have to do something about this, which I know not everybody feels when they hear about democracy. So with that, I'm going to pass it to these two amazing facilitators to take the lead, my really good and close friends and our amazing guides through this session. So Kyson, take it away.
Thank you, Kelsey. And it's lovely to see a bunch of familiar faces and obviously really lovely to also see some new ones, hoping to get to know you all a little better. Kelsey said, my name is Kyson Bunthuwong. It's only by chance that Haley and I are also in the same city. So zooming in from Oakland, I'm a fundraiser. I am now working in the field of liberatory design, which is essentially design thinking married with social justice. And I love partnering with nonprofits to really unlock new avenues of resources for them. So I am also part of a collective giving group called Lacuna, based out of the Bay Area. And we also have some folks in LA where we pool our money to fund social justice organizations, particularly ones that serve the API community. So I'm just super excited to dive in a little more with our content today, but for now, I'll also pass it off to Haley to introduce themselves.
Thank you, Kyson and Kelsey alike. Hello to friends new and old today. I'm Haley Bash. I use she, they pronouns. I am the founder and executive director of an organization called Donor Organizer Hub. We focus on training, convening, and coaching everyday people to fundraise for their communities for social movements. So I work with movement organizations to help build out their volunteer fundraising programs, peer-to-peer programs, giving circles, you name it. And I also support volunteer leaders that are doing this work and often are underrepresented and under-resourced. So building base in our movements through building leaders in fundraising our movements. Like Kyson, I live in Oakland. We actually co-worked in person for every single session and preparing this, which was a very sweet opportunity as somebody that mostly lives on the internet in my organizing work. I live in an apartment here, a studio apartment with our 2 cats and a squat rack. We can talk about that later if you're interested or curious about weightlifting. I'll hand it over to you, Kyson.
Awesome. And just to set the agenda, so thank you again, Kelsey, for kicking off our welcome and grounding. We're going to be talking about where and who philanthropic giving is going, so overall trends in philanthropy and some big stats for you to look at. We're also going to look at what is 501c4 giving and how does it impact your collective giving group. We'll have a little bit of a discussion and prompting later on to really kind of hit it home and make it applicable to you all. So particularly around this question, how does giving to 501c4 impact your group and marrying that? And then lastly, maybe we'll leave a little time for you all to do some journaling, reflection, and call to action, because obviously we want you to walk away from this feeling empowered to move the work forward. So if that sounds all good to you, I also want to encourage you all to introduce yourself. It's always nice to see who's here in the room and how can we best serve you with this this content at work. So just drop that in if you haven't done that. But with that, I'll just kick it off. And somewhat of a interesting image to start off with, but really to begin, it's just helpful to name explicitly the reason why this topic around democracy and funding it is to be explored in this room today. So we know and feel that political divisions are really high. Racial strife is definitely rooted in our country's history and so much of what we're feeling today. And there's even been flirtations with fascism, I would say, in recent years. So particularly as these new concerns have been raised and surfaced around the deterioration of democracy and some of our democratic institutions here in the US, what is it that foundations, donors, nonprofits can do and should seek to do to use their dollars and beyond their dollars to respond and alter this course that we're on. Particularly for US democracy as a crisis, we should be raising big questions around, in this day and age, what is our civic obligations? How are we taking for granted American democracy, both in the past and currently? What does it take to preserve essentially the democratic values that we so hold dear as a part of the fabric of the society? And I saw recently on a webinar where a speaker said, quote, we really need to think about our strengths, our weaknesses, and particularly in the first person plural. So the quintessential we, like this question of we, and how do we come back to we? And the question I have for all of you too, in thinking through this content is, yeah, how can we move all towards what we like to call a multiracial democracy in particular? So to define that, we pulled together this great kind of definition from Democracy Fund. And just to read it, it's a multiracial democracy is a just and inclusive society that has reckoned with structural racism, equitable participation, voice, and power for communities of color, representative and accountable political institutions, and a vibrant and equitable information ecosystem that meets the civic needs of communities. So maybe just let a few of those things sit with you. And really it'll take this kind of multi-racial democracy kind of definition from different lenses, and particularly someone myself, where my identity is queer, is Asian. The way I experience and interpret democracy in this country is very different from others, and maybe similar or not to your perceptions of what democracy is. And what I try to hold as hope is to see shifts in the structures and then also the systems that move us towards kind of this definition of what a multiracial democracy is, where things like anti-Asian hate and mass incarceration of Black and Brown folks and lots of other issues in our communities and marginalized communities really need to be a part of that conversation alongside democracy. So this is why we also want to present this as framing for the discussion today. Now, we're going to also look at particularly what is the philanthropic giving trends and what overall that looks like, just to also give you some context setting. So here is a kind of quick pie chart on overall giving put together by Giving USA, which is an organization that puts together an annual report on the overall state of philanthropy. Their most recent findings show this breakdown of charitable giving, and this is specifically focused in the US. 499.33 billion is given to charity and nonprofit organizations. And of that whole pie, individuals still very much make up the majority of contributions at 64%, so about $319 billion, with the rest being composed of 21% foundations, 6% at corporations, and also bequests, so like planned giving. And while total giving by individuals continues to grow over time, and this number continues to grow, it still actually has fallen in the past 4 years below 70% of overall giving. So consecutively, as even though the larger kind of pie has been growing, individual giving has stayed stagnant and fallen. So we're seeing, particularly with this economy and the way things are moving, individuals are still a majority, but still giving less than what is the potential. Moving on to further dive deep into some of the specifics. Nonprofits, I also want to mention in that larger figure, do include universities, hospitals, and religious institutions. So, you might think of local organizations in your community, grassroots organizations, and giving in those realms. But I also want to mention that of this kind of larger number, the big kind of giving across institutions includes universities, hospitals, and religious institutions. So, and in particular, public society benefit organizations that do make up democratic giving and giving to democracy accounts for only about 9% of total contributions. And these organizations serve a number of things and issues like voter education, civil rights, community and economic development. So kind of in the grand scheme of things, still kind of middle of the road in terms of overall giving, much lower than religion, human services, education, etc. This slide, we also want to account for what are foundations giving. So we found this stat that less than 2% of all philanthropic dollars from foundations spent in the past decade have been dedicated to efforts promoting democracy. So things along the lines of advancing voting, promoting civics participation, news and media, etc. So particularly for individual giving groups and individual donors, there's really an opportunity to step up and address this gap and focus on these issues. We know that giving circles by nature are already primed to civically participate and contribute locally. What does it mean to build solidarity, work within your community, and move the needle on some of the dollars and beyond in this realm? So I think these are some of the sentiments that we must acknowledge and overcome in the funding landscape, and we all have contributions to pay against these. I know we continue to spiral down in building this presentation. We know that some of these stats are kind of glaring and not what we want to be hearing, but we were also found in this recent Pew Research report, trust in the federal government is among the lowest we've seen in 70 years. And almost 3 in 10 Americans express unfavorable views of both major parties, the highest level we've seen in decades. People under the age of 50 are alienated, with 35% having unfavorable views of both parties. 1/4 of Americans do not feel represented by either party. 2/3 say they are not satisfied with the candidates who have so far emerged. We really feel this kind of weight and heaviness in the state of America, and kind of distrust in our institutions, and how do we kind of sit with that? And I would love to further explore later how that's all making you feel. To continue to go down that rabbit hole, in that same research, they found that 17% thought that donating to a nonprofit or charity could actually be really effective. Only 17%. Only 15% thought campaign volunteering was actually useful. 13% thought political donations even mattered. And then barely 10% thought protest rallies could change anything. So really just kind of this despair around and heaviness there. But we know that all these things actually truly matter, right? And organizing around this is something that we must keep doing despite this despair. So just to point you to some additional resources on giving, we wanted to point to Candid, democracy.candid.org. This is a really great nonpartisan data visualization tool for you if you want to explore some of the grants, size of grants, some of the funders who are really shaping this work in democracy. And it looks at the past 2011 to present years around that type of giving. So I think Kelsey will be sharing that in the chat if you want to explore further. But really, we are trying to get you to say that there is some light, right? Over the past 12 years, $15.6 billion in funding, particularly within philanthropic entities, have been moving money towards democracy-related efforts around those things such as campaigns, elections, voting, government institutions, journalism, media, and civic participation. So where you can see some of those grants play out, I think that that tool I just presented can be really helpful in hopefully showing that there is possibilities and organizations doing the work. And with this, we also found these stats and percentages around particular populations affected by democracy efforts: children, youth, women and girls, immigrants and migrants, racial ethnic minorities, and the economically disadvantaged. Those people feel when democracy is not serving us the right way. And there's great organizations that are working specifically with populations like this to advance the work. I want to call out an organization called Justice for Migrant Women. They recently got $1 million grant in 2023. And what they do is their mission is to advance human and civil rights of migrant women and their families. They created this whole rural civic engagement initiative where they wanted to see political representation and power building among rural women and girls across the US. And how do you elevate that leadership, particularly among women of color and underrepresented community members to affect change and democratically affect change? So there are really great on the ground groups doing this work to build power, to shift power, to enable resources to people that might not feel the effects of current state of democracy. But I think we can really once again lean on those groups and invest in them in ways that really ignite their vision. So I do want to take a quick pause and come up with this reflection point for you all. And yeah, what are you really sitting with? What really surprised you about these trends in philanthropic giving? And if you want to maybe drop one word on how you're feeling or surprised, what surprised you in the chat, or if anyone wants to also come off mute and share any thoughts, I'll take a moment for that too. Honestly sad, yeah. Beth says, while I'm not surprised by the low percent of corporate giving, I am shocked. Feels like this can be much higher. Right. Thank you, Beth. No surprises, Betty. Yeah. Well, not to only sit in the swamp and stew. I think one of the things we tried to do was, what are some of those great organizations or in giving circle networks that are really advancing collective giving as a solution, right, to some of our issues in democracy? And I want to call out the States Project, as one of those giving circle networks that does that. One of their fundamental beliefs is that state legislatures are the strongest force for change in this country. So when they work with their giving circles, they provide them with tools and expertise and support needed to engage their friends and the community on particularly why that kind of state legislature level matters. They help identify state chambers and game-changing districts where donors and giving circles can make the biggest difference. And then ultimately, they rely on giving circles to pool donations and resources, select those states to invest in, and then really try to make a change in local elections. So I'm going to quickly play for you the video, which introduces their work. The one thing I will also plug is that
I'm Melissa Walker, and I work with Giving Circles on the States Project. I'm a children's book author, but in December of 2016, I attended a holiday party where I heard then New York State Senator Daniel Squadron speak. And what I learned blew my mind. Everything that I was worried about and everything that my family and friends were worried about, from education funding to environmental policy to healthcare to civil rights, the very core of our democracy, voting rights, all of these things were being decided in state capitals, not in Washington, D.C. I found out that it is often cheaper to change the balance of power in a state chamber than it is to win a single competitive congressional seat. Take that in for a second. I am not someone who can hand giant checks to politicians, but I am someone who can gather my network and little by little raise an impactful fundraising total that can change the balance of power in a state. And so are you. Giving circles start with one person who asks another person to join a team with them and do this state's project. Their work is focused on the majority makers. Those are the people that are going to change the balance of power in a state capital. And when you change the balance of power to elect people who are focused on improving lives, that's when policies change. In Maine in 2018, I worked with 2 giving circles who focused on trying to change the balance of power in the state Senate. It happened. It changed. And in Augusta, the next year, lawmakers raised teacher pay, expanded environmental protections, expanded health care for women, and lowered the cost of prescription drugs. Those giving circles were connected to those policy changes and to the lives of millions of Mainers that were improved because of the new majority there. When you form a giving circle and start to bring in your friends, your family, your networks, you start to understand that we all have this power to engage our communities and create real change.
So we're seeing, I mean, collective giving groups and giving circles are making change, and they're trying to figure out what levers can we pull on? What are those things that we can start with to start moving the needle on this work? And I'm gonna also pass it now to Haley to talk about some of those levers.
I'm Melissa Walker, and I work with.
All right. Here we go.
Thanks, Kyson. I always just feel such a blanket of gratitude whenever I hear Melissa's voice. I don't know who of us in this room might be familiar. Whether you are or not, definitely come to the next session with Melissa, because she is somebody that really puts at the heart of, yes, things are bleak right now, and we can do something about it. So we are entering into that space now of what can we do about it. And a key entry point we see for collective giving circles is focused on what is called 501c4 giving. Some of us might be deep in the weeds and we know everything about this landscape, and it's like, cool, you're an advanced student through this section. Others of us, it's our first time hearing it. And so I want to make sure that we're all grounded in the same vocabulary as we move through into this solution space. So what is a 501c4? The IRS calls it a social welfare organization, and there's some history about it in the early 20th century. So in 1913, you didn't know this was going to be a history class, but here we are. This is the Revenue Act of 1913, which introduced the concept of a 501c3 not-for-profit organization, and it contained 3 main parts. So 1, those 501c3 organizations were exempt from federal income tax. 2, there was no private benefit. So it's a public benefit to us all. So you can make an argument for an education nonprofit, a church, or whatever else. There's some public benefit that's happening there. The third part is that donors, this is a big one for those of us in collective giving groups, donors receive income tax deduction for those contributions. So that's a 501c3. When people say nonprofits, that's often synonymous with 501c3. Just some other numbers that are thrown out there because the IRS loves numbers. This number 527, some of us might have heard about PACs, political action committees, they're called, or independent expenditures, all of these sort of inside baseball terms for political spending. Those are used to influence elections directly. We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but 527, that number is you are influencing elections directly. What we're focusing on today, where we think collective giving groups can be in that sweet spot to really make shifts in our democracy and be able to live into our missions and values through the issues we care about most, is 501c4s, which social welfare organizations are designed to do advocacy. So Kyson, we have the next slide. Okay, so this is a big chart here, but this is going to give you all the answers to curiosities or confusion you've ever had about what is a political organization? Like, how does this work? What is going on? Money, politics, what does any of this mean? We're going to talk through it today. It's going to be great. And this is a tool too that you can reference beyond today. Kelsey's going to be sharing the slides afterwards. So I know for some of us, I know myself included, it's nice to review these things, but let's give it a first start here. So on the far left, we have the 501c3s that we were talking about. These are the organizations that you donate to. There's a tax deduction that comes with it. What the IRS calls them is charitable and educational. What they can do is they can do a little bit of lobbying, not a ton, tiny bit, and some nonpartisan electoral work. What that means in practice is that 501c3s can advocate, they can endorse yes or no on ballot initiatives. Many of us live in states where we have voted yes or no on a ballot initiative. A 501c3 can endorse a ballot initiative, a yes or a no vote. They cannot endorse a candidate and they cannot hold a candidate accountable. So if a local candidate with an issue that we really care about is doing some slimy deal business, a 501c3 can't hold them accountable. They can't say, hey, public official, you've been doing naughty business here. And we also can't say, hey, this candidate that's up for election this year really cares about our issue and they have a plan to implement it into action. So in that realm of 501c3, we unfortunately can't do that. That's where we're constrained. In terms of money limits, there's no contribution limits. You can give $1, you can give $1 million. 501c3s will lovingly accept all of that. For lack of anonymity, there's no public disclosure of 501c3s. So it's all anonymous if that is something that is important to your group. We're going to move, before we get into example organizations, this bottom row here, I'm going to talk about each of the other ones just so that we have a general overview. 501c4s. This is the area, this is the sweet spot where we can see collective giving groups starting to think about moving toward. The reason being is there's a bit more action that 501c4 organizations can take in the lobbying and electoral space. So they focus on issue advocacy and policy. They allow for more lobbying. It's close to half of their budget can be focused on lobbying, not over half, but very close to half, which is a good chunk. And they can endorse candidates. They can call out public officials that are in office. So you can imagine, I'm sure you've seen, on social media or wherever else, where that is happening. 501c4 is that spot right there. It is that sweet spot. However, they cannot work directly with candidates. So that is where they don't get into the influencing election space. Like a C3, no contribution limits. They'll take $1, they'll take $1 million. Not usually publicly disclosed, if that is useful information for you. 501c3 and 501c4 are what political insiders call the soft side of political giving. The reason being is that the work is not directly influencing elections. People are focusing mainly on building out and mobilizing their communities. They might be calling out the official, they might be, celebrating the elected official, but they're not actually coordinating directly with the candidate or political official, and they don't have as much leeway into lobbying. We all have heard time and time again, lobbyists, get money off politics. There are so many lobbyists that are deciding what issues our elected officials care about most and not everyday people. So On the second half, to the right of this chart, we got the 527s. I was talking about that magic number 527, right? That is what we call the hard side in contrast to the soft side. The hard side is where that lobbying happens. That's where, the sort of DC people in their suits go up, talk to public officials, they wheel and deal behind closed doors. Some of it's very legitimate, and we want sometimes an inside-outside game. It's not wrong. It's not necessarily evil, but there can be a disproportionate amount of power to those that have wealth or political access or connections that everyday people don't. And so there are two types of 527s. This is getting really geeky here. You're going to impress all your friends at the cocktail party for knowing this, but the big difference between an individual expenditure and a PAC, there's two things. One is that independent expenditures can't coordinate with elected officials, right? Once there's a certain date that happens, that it's closer to the election, they can't talk to each other. And independent expenditures have no contribution limits. You can write that $1 million check. PACs, on the other hand, have coordinated electoral work, so they can talk to that elected official directly, that candidate directly, and plan things out together. And there's also limits, though. And something to keep in mind is that these donations are disclosed with the Federal Elections Commission, so that information is publicly available. At this bottom row here, I want to talk through these example organizations. So oftentimes, because of our weird tax codes, all these numbers, all this confusing stuff, organizations will have multiple different entities that you can give to. Movement for Black Lives is a great example of that. So their 501c3 arm is Movement for Black Lives. Then they also built out C4, IE, and PAC arms. So their C4 arm is Movement for Black Lives Electoral Justice Project. Their IE arm is the Frontline. And their PAC is the Black Lives Matter PAC. So something that we want you all to kind of reference back to this, and I know this is a lot of info to digest in one webinar, is kind of being curious about, with your collective giving group, where are you giving right now? Are you in that C3 bucket solely? What does it look like if you move a little more to the right? What would need to change in your governance? What would need to change in any sort of piece of the operations of your collective giving group? And thinking about how will this help you align with your values and your mission. So I'll do the next slide. Thanks, Kyson. So we got a current gap, and I'm just going to name it. I don't know if folks have been seeing in various social justice giving circles, there's been a talk of a funding gap that has existed. And so I want to give kind of concretely what that gap kind of is in context. So the reality is that most people in political funding, they give directly to candidates. They're not thinking about that chart I just showed you at all. They're thinking about, especially top ticket, president, US Senate, House races. And not that it's invalid, but we all know that a lot of this money does go to paid advertising, digital ads, TV ads, things that aren't necessarily building the multiracial democracy as directly as other interventions. The second part is that most people interested in movement organizations support 501c3 organizations. The reason being is this big talk of tax deductions. And we're going to get into that in a second to just kind of break that apart a bit. But I just want to be grounded in the fact that those of us oftentimes as donors, when we're thinking about supporting movement organizations, we're keeping the far left of that chart. We're only thinking C3 because we have been socialized to think tax deductions, baby, let's get it. And so 501c4 organizations experience a pretty deep scarcity in funding, relatively speaking, especially in off-election years. Now, the political nerds in this room might be saying, Haley, there's never an off-election year, and I don't disagree with you. Virginia has mad elections going on right now. Things are tight. Ohio's got a big ballot initiative going on this year. All across the country, all the time, there's elections everywhere. It's confusing for all of us as citizens of democracy. And those off-election years where there isn't some flashy presidential candidate or a scary presidential candidate that drives people to write checks, these organizations aren't getting the support that they need. And I want to actually take a pause really quickly, just a temperature check in the room, and ask you all to kind of share in the chat. Does your collective giving group right now do any giving outside of 501c3? meaning that it's not tax deductible. It is very loving and okay to say no. I don't think so. No, not right now. Not that I know. No. Yes, we got a yes. This is new to me, so it sounded like a no. We've got a lot of no's. We got a lot of newbies. That is beautiful and generative for this space. Not right now. Excited to hear about this. We do not. This is great. This is exactly what we wanted to hear. If it was a bunch of folks that were like, oh yeah, Haley, Kyson, we got this together, it'd be like, okay, well, I guess we'll take a break for lunch. See y'all later. So we won't be doing that. Could I have the next slide, Kyson? I want to talk about, in a deeper sense, what 501c4 organizations can do that oftentimes C3 organizations either can't entirely or they're very limited in their work of doing it. So the first one is developing platforms to guide endorsements and organizing candidates in support of them. So I'm sure a lot of us as voters, when we are thinking about who am I going to vote for? How do I think about this ballot? I'm a resident of California. We have 1.5 million ballots. I can't do this alone and read all the legalese myself. I rely on other organizations and individuals that I trust to help me guide my decision making. And so if you've ever opened an organizational endorsement guide that includes candidates, that's a 501c4 doing that work for you. They're doing, maybe an interview with the candidate to build out the recommendations. They're digging deep into the research. But ultimately, they're helping us as everyday people who are really busy with full-time jobs and dependent care and whatever else, make the connection between the issues that we care about most and the candidates that are on the ballot. Another piece that's provided on the C4 landscape is development for movement staff and volunteer leaders. While this technically can be provided on the C3 landscape, you can imagine that leadership possibilities are really, really limited when we don't have any possibility to be able to hold elected officials and candidates accountable to bringing issues to the table. It really keeps us into, for example, nonpartisan voter registration drives, which are beautiful and important and they serve a purpose, but it doesn't put all the power on the table that's needed for us to have the wins that we need to build a multiracial democracy. Other pieces, again, these show up in C3 contexts, but they aren't nearly as powerful, potentially, as a C4 opportunity. One is door knocking, relational organizing, and events. So you can imagine, so I could knock on your door today and say, hey, Kyson, I'm a neighbor of your community. I would love if you voted. And that's often where the 501c3 conversation is left, is like, I hope you vote. I'm a community member. I hope you vote. I can't give you too many directives on why to vote, what to vote for, or why I believe what I think I'm voting for is important. And so I'm sure you've all have seen on social media, there's a lot of celebrities that'll post a few days before election saying like, it's important to vote. And I would say that's kind of the C3 landscape of intervention with people. And C4 allows for us to really get deeper into the issues and talking about how they connect to our government officials. And the final piece, again, tied into this concept of we can do it in C3, C4 makes it more effective, more direct in terms of connecting the dots, is phone and text contact, digital and traditional ads, social media. And so again, when we're thinking about doing broadcast communication, sort of broad narrative messaging, go vote, it's important, it's your civic duty. Sure, of course. And there are a lot of issues where we can get really down to the nitty gritty and say what is important and what's coming up, and the connective tissue of who can or cannot be a power broker to help us get there. Can I have the next slide? All right, we have a text heavy slide now. And I want to say, with what we're about to talk about here, tax deductions, I would not consider this to be the most important takeaway for you all as participants. What I want this to be is a conversation piece, a potential supportive resource for you all as you're navigating these conversations with your collective giving groups. And I believe Kelsey will share the link in the chat. This comes from a piece from Rebecca Gordon, who is a nonprofit consultant who focuses on social justice groups and helping them with their fundraising to move away from the language of your gift is tax deductible toward language of power building. The reason being is that a lot of times nonprofits might start off as a C3 and they use that language, their donors get familiar with it. Then they realize, oh shoot, there's only so much we can only do like this much lobbying with our local officials, and it's very limited work. Let's build a C4. But then suddenly, none of their donors want to give to the C4 because it's not tax deductible. So she works a lot in this landscape. This piece in full provides a really great context setting from the perspective of a donor, thinking about what does a tax deduction really mean to us, as well as for movement organizations on how to shift that language over so that we are all building toward that multiracial democracy that we want. I know not all of us are math and numbers people, so I don't want us to get overwhelmed by the numbers that are on this slide, but I'm going to read this to us, and then we're going to kind of debrief on what this means. So suppose you give a qualifying charity $100. That will reduce your tax bill by the same amount, right? Nope. That $100 gift will reduce the amount of your income that you pay on taxes by half the amount of your gift, or $50. This means that if you, like most working folks, pay federal taxes at an effective rate of less than 15%, the amount that you save on taxes by giving $100 is less than 15% of $50, or a whopping $7.50, the price of a couple of fancy coffee drinks. So I'm going to take many steps back here. That was a lot of numbers, a lot of info. Let's digest. So if I give $100 to a 501c3 organization, what I'm getting back as a normal working person tax bracket is $7.50. For me personally, I don't want to speak for everybody else in this room, but for me personally, protecting our democracy is worth much more to me than $7.50. And this is an intentionally agitational piece that I want each of us to think about. It doesn't have to be that we say, forget all 501c3 opportunities, or even that we enter into 501c4 at all. All this is doing is to help us really be in alignment with, is what we're doing living up to our mission and values, given the stakes at hand? And, given all the data that Kyson threw at us earlier. Next slide, please, Kyson. Y'all can tell by now, I'm a very wordy person, and I could talk at you all day about this stuff, but Working Families Party does this a lot better than I can, and I will just leave this section for us at working class people don't live 501c3 eligible lives. And Kyson's going to take it over now to go us through the taking action space with our group.
Thanks, Haley. Yeah, and for us too, we know that the pieces that you'll be taking back is not only the content, but potentially conversations, right? So how does it actually affect your group to do 501c4 giving? And for me, as a part of the giving circle, I think the thing that I think about a lot is there will be shifts in conversations, right? Just as a example, my Lacuna Giving Circle recently had a retreat. What would it have meant for me to carve out a space in our retreat and time to spend maybe an hour or two talking about 501c4s, to engage differently civically? What does it mean to be a participant in our local communities in new ways? So for us, it really is about not only feeling that the state of democracy is at stakes, but also having those harder conversations to say, we've been doing these things for the past 10 years. We always talk about shifting and growing and coming out of our cocoon in new ways. Part of that is having a real frank conversation on what it means to contribute to a multiracial democracy. And to be honest, we have not gone there as an organization and giving circle that's been around for 10 years, and particularly one that identifies and self-identifies as a social justice, a giving circle that is like core to our identity, but we've not had that hard conversation yet. So really, how can we all, and this is something that I will hold myself accountable towards as a co-chair of my giving circle, is how can we go deeper with each other and shift some of these conversations and narrative on what it means to be a giving circle or do social justice work or engage civically. I would love to spend more time in that soup and and sit there with my members because I know they do care about it. So, and just to kind of kick things off towards action, we bulleted out some of the questions that you might want to take to your group. But we also want to work with you on and brainstorm what are those questions that really will spur that type of and deeper level and engaged discussion on what it means to invest in democracy. So, the first one, what issues do you care about and who's working on them in your community? Maybe you bring that to your group. What do the groups on the ground and organizations need from us at this point in time? If we've only focused on 501c3s so far, why is it that we've all done that way? Questioning that why. Then lastly, what do we gain as a group by investing in 501c4? Maybe it helps us go deeper in our mission. Maybe it's more aligned with our values, whatever that kind of key is in solution, that could be unlocked with 501c4. So we want to take a moment with you all to brainstorm. Write out a question that you would love to bring to your giving circle or collective giving group. Put that in the chat, but don't hit enter yet. We want everyone to waterfall in their question, and we'll see what everyone's kind of come up with. So I'll give it maybe a minute or so and maybe start brainstorming. What is that question that you want to spur discussion with your giving circle members? Maybe 10, 15 more seconds. And all right, if you have a question that you'd like to bring, please hit enter and we'll see that in the chat. Anyone wants to share? All right. First question, what is the true hesitancy and nervousness in supporting advocacy work? Great. What are we afraid is going to happen? Oh man, getting to the heart of it. How can we give most effectively for the long run? Yes. Who benefits from us feeling weird about stepping beyond 501c3 giving? Great. What is at stake if we fail to invest in democracy? Really powerful question. Would we consider donating to a 501c4? If no, why? There's something we're afraid of, more leaning into that afraid and resonant as a theme there. Who is doing this work in our community? Does our giving circle believe in and want to work toward a multiracial democracy? If not, what do we believe in? If so, what can we do next? What is the difference really between a 501c3 and C4 when it comes to collective giving or giving circle giving? What are the perceived challenges or risks? And how can we move money to 501c4 organizations? The system we currently have does not have the capability. Man, steal each other's, totally be robbers and steal each other's questions here, because these are all really great fodder for deeper discussions on what it means to deepen your work in your communities and affect local change and also national change. So I love all of these. I'm going to pass it back to Haley to take us to the next step.
Thanks, Kyson. All right, we have these questions in the chat. You all have probably been doing your own reflecting and marinating as Kyson and I have been going through this presentation today. One thing we wanted to name, and we'll call it the elephant in the room, is probably what's coming up for y'all. Like, what might come from these conversations? Something I want to ground us in, and this is really our North Star here. What might come from these conversations, what should come from these conversations, is a clear alignment of our priorities and values as a collective giving group. So thinking about, what do we believe in? What do we want to build? What do we invest in to get there? We're here today, North Star's over there in a few tomorrows. How do we navigate that path? Something we want to be aware of, and this is something that happens in any collective organizing ever, bring up your favorite civil rights movement, whatever else organizers, they've gotten into conflict. And to get into clear alignment, there may be some disagreement along the way. Focus on what is best for your collective giving group as a whole. We're going to be talking about tips in just a second here, what that looks like. But I really want to emphasize that in explicitly naming your priorities and values, what might come up, and this is healthy, this shows organizational growth, this shows continuation of focusing on your mission and your values. You might lose certain folks, you might gain new ones. This is expected behavior. And I don't want us to be overwhelmed or scared by that. I don't want us to see that possibility and think, oh my God, I really can't take this to my collective giving group. I can't bring that question that I just posted in the chat there, because what if we lose XYZ person? First and foremost, I'm giving you the worst case scenario right in front of you, because we just got to name the elephant sometimes. Likely won't happen. And it's important for us as we evolve to really think about taking it slowly. This is not an overnight thing. This really is meant to be a discussion. You are in relationship with these people who you have grown to value, that you have grown to learn to receive, and also to provide support from. And so we wanted to give some generative tips as you're navigating these conversations. First and foremost is to lean into curiosity. I know a lot of us in the moment, especially when things feel new, and we're very passionate, we can feel our nervous system jump up and we want to jump to conclusions. We want to respond immediately to whatever somebody is expressing. And instead of thinking about an exclamatory statement, think about what a question is. I hear what you're saying. For example, maybe somebody says, we shouldn't get involved in politics. There's other ways that we can support the issues that we care about without touching any of that. Just saying, I hear that. There really could be some other ways that we can support. What has you nervous about entering into the advocacy landscape? Just really naming, like, I see you, what you're seeing is a possibility, but also where is the concern coming from? Unearthing where there may be generative disagreement, and this is something that Kyson was just referencing earlier with their giving circle, is really naming as a value that disagreement isn't a bad thing. It makes us all better. And what matters is how we navigate through it together, leaning into it with curiosity, with patience, and with love. This doesn't have to be a magical 1 hour conversation when we're deciding whether we do C4 giving or what C4 entities we're giving to. Allow yourself to move at the pace that disagreement can be generative. Yes, Guff, thank you. With disagreement, holding tenderness in the tension. Navigating through the challenges together will hopefully strengthen your group in the long run. Thank you, Kyson. And finally, something that you can always reference, because we know you all have that built out, is utilize your group's decision-making methods. Sometimes in the moment, we just kind of need a reference for ourselves. How did we agree that we're going to organize together? And that can be a useful tool as well as you're navigating these conversations. Kyson, could I get the next slide, please? All right, everyone. We're going to start taking action. And the first place of action in my dear heart is reflection. And so we are going to focus today. You all got a lot of information thrown at you about democracy and philanthropy's intersection. What is 501c4 giving? How can collective giving groups step up to build a multiracial democracy? We want you to reflect on what brings you personally the most excitement in infusing your collective giving group's mission and work with building a multiracial democracy, and why. We gave you some options in case it's helpful for generative thought: civic education and learning, membership engagement, advocacy and organizing, defining certain areas of giving like civic engagement, fair processes, responsive policy. Is it something else? And Kelsey, I'll pass it over to you to make journal time happen. Got some music for us?
Your colleague Kyson is actually pulling up some lo-fi tunes right now.
Kyson's doing the music. DJ switch up here. I love to see it. Kyson, bring us the music.
I'll try. Hopefully everyone likes my music choices, but something easy to journal to. So I'll pick some. How's the sound? Is okay? Great. All right, I think we have 1 minute left as the time check. All right, I think we'll end on that spooky trick or treat track since we're in October. We also wanted you to think about potentially sharing and or writing one sweet small next step for your collective giving group and giving circle to take to explore your role in building a multiracial democracy. So Haley, do you want to facilitate a share moment?
Yes, you all, the stage is yours now. You have had the opportunity to get some info digest. We have just reflected. Now we're entering the sharing space. I'm going to give you two options. You have to do one though, okay? One, share in the Zoom chat, or two, you can come off mute. Whatever makes you feel like you're stepping into your power, you're going to share one sweet small next step that you will take with your collective giving group to explore your role in building a multiracial democracy, in investing in advocacy work, in dipping your toes into 501c4 work. So feel free to share over chat or hop off of mute.
So I think I'm gonna go. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Drew, let's do this.
I'm sitting on my porch because my kid's skateboarding. Um, so I'm watching him. So one of the things that my group, I mean it's multiracial because we're BIPOC, predominantly men who are who identify as LGBTQIA+. We've been sort of, we've supported 3 candidates who are, LGBTQ in kind of like weird collective ways, like, gay guys, we like a party, right? So we've had a party, had parties as fundraisers, which were great. But I think we're now sort of talking about sort of like, how do we like, clearly decide we're going to get like 100 folks together and each person's going to raise $1,000 for 24, and here's what our giving is going to be. And I've been sort of like reflecting kind of like what's the way to kind of like pull the trigger to say like, make your commitment and or your gift before December 31st. And I was thinking, oh, like I've got to say like, because you can deduct it, but they can't. So now like I'm dancing on like like, how do I say make your gift nicely? But I'm making a commitment to have coffee with Brandon to say, we got to figure this out.
I love that so much. Something that I do, because there's a lot of shifting of that language going on right now all across the ecosystem, is like, end your year off right with some intention setting to align your actions with your values. If people do the winter holiday stuff, you can like throw that pizzazz in there, like in lieu of gifts, insert donation here. But there's a lot in terms of, fresh start energy, I think that people are feeling kind of toward the end of the year, going into a new year, that you might be able to plug in there. Does that resonate at all, Drew? Oh,
so I have mute. So I'm thinking that, but I'm also thinking at the same time, like, I don't know. I feel like all of our giving is kind of like really like event focused, and I'm not sure whether I just throw like a holiday party. Like, I don't know. Like I'm dancing right now. Like, what's the best way to kind of get folks to kind of commit and give? Because I think that we all have the capacity to do so. I just think that sort of like we need some re-education as donors, because I think that we're thinking like I've got to give something. I've got to get something with my gift that I'm giving. So
I love this.
that.
Yeah, this is such a generative set of ideas and exploration you can do with your group. It looks like, so for other folks.
And Haley, I'm gonna do a plug that you shared with me, this bat signal blog and article, where one part of it was like what it means to start doing early funding versus late funding. So in the sense of how can you invest earlier so that groups can scale their power and maximize their reach from the early onset, rather than waiting to closer to election time or dates when things are just super critical, things might be more reactionary. So what does it mean to be a part of that upfront planning effort, right, for these groups and organizing that way? So it's kind of giving organizations or candidates like the foresight, right, to plan and utilize kind of funding upfront, if that makes sense. So I really love that in that article and just want to call that out.
Yeah,
Yes.
Drew.
I hate to be teacher's pet, but I've got a really great question, Kason. So like, I get that part, but I feel like it's kind of, it almost feels like there's a call, or there's like a call to urgency, like like I don't know. I live in New Jersey. We always have a primary.
Mm,
There's an election, right? So like there's like this urgent call like in May because like the primary's in June, and people are like ready to give then, versus when you ask them in February, they're like, oh, that's not gonna happen until like I don't know, 2 weeks before the thing, or like in October, like like next week, I'm going to a fundraiser for the November election. I mean, probably it's pointless, but like, you know, I don't know that I've seen folks sort of think about being thoughtful and sort of like planning way
mm.
ahead, and more being responsive to like the sense of urgency. And so if either of you can kind of shed some real light on how do I shift that in my ecosystem, that would be really helpful.
Oh,
Yeah, no.
Kelsey looks like.
Kyson, what are you thinking?
No, Kelsey, go.
Kelsey
Um,
goes,
Drew, I actually have a lot of thoughts for you on this, and it is not going to be easy because it's not necessarily the most fun thing to learn about. But what I would encourage you to do as a leader in your group is to create a space where your members can really learn about these like boom bust cycles, right? Or how money moves, right? Because I think for so many of us who either came to philanthropy late in life, or we just consider ourselves everyday donors, and so we're like, how much power do we really have? Often what we don't get privy to are the conversations that happen with the electeds who are organizing their staff around what money their campaign needs. Or if you're looking at it from a nonprofit setting, which is where I know most of my stuff, there's this whole book called The Revolution Will Not Be Funded. And it just talks all about how big philanthropy and these giant grants aren't actually going to get us to where we need. And so if you start doing that kind of education amongst your group, you all start reading about it. Maybe you start reading this blog post that Kyson shared in the chat about like funding early, and really understanding the why behind the ask for funding early. It may incline some of your members to be like, right, I'm not feeling the urgency right now, or I'm not feeling the excitement because the election isn't like next day. But I'm understanding that even though I'm not feeling the excitement, it doesn't mean it's any less important. And so what I've seen in my life is it's like, finding ways to make those moments be like fun and engaging, even though it can be a little bit in the weeds, is just so crucial. And it's not going to be, you read an essay and you're like, okay, our minds are totally changed. It's a culture changing, internal organizing moment, right? Maybe you sit there and you have a conversation with someone in your group where you're like, I know that they're already thinking very similarly to me, and it's not going to take a lot for me to push them to be an advocate for this shift, right? So then you have two people in your group who are already on board, right? And from there, who do you two have relationships with that you can bring in even more? Taking on that organizer culture shift mindset, it can be tedious, it can feel unrewarding, but once you finally get to that location, it can be just really powerful. So those are my thoughts. Sorry to steal your thunder, Kyson and Haley.
You magnified the thunder. Thank you, Kelsey.
what other intention setting would folks like to share right now? Please come off mic. It becomes even more visible and viable when we name it. So this is your space. This is your stage, friends. We have some real goodies in the chat. Really wanted to share Guff's quickly. So she's going to share the session recording with her local org leaders and ask a few guiding questions, mentioning, really reflecting on why do we exist and digging deeper. So asking 5 more whys and 5 more whys. And yeah, seems like helping to build a multiracial democracy is the deepest why. I would agree. What else is coming up for folks? What's another step? Who else has a step? We all have a step.
And I'll quickly share Nia's in the chat as well. So since we're going through a strategic planning process right now, fun, bringing up the question of where does supportive advocacy work, democracy fit into grant making priorities? Like really great way to align strategy or your visioning with this work. And this might be the opportune time.
Betty, I see that you are off mic, and I am wondering if the off mic.
Well, I'm not part of a giving circle. I'm part of Together Women Rise, and we have chapters. And as part of it, Together Women Rise has an advocacy group that members can be part of. So I plan on encouraging members to work with this advocacy group, who also then work with all the Congress people. We meet with Congress people, we talk to Congress people. But we each have chapters. I have a chapter as well as a region. My plan is I want to talk to my members more strongly. I've talked to them a little bit about the advocacy group. And I want to talk to them a little more. And I want to say, there are a bunch of 501c4. Let's talk about 501c4 groups and what they do. And I'm involved with several 401c13 groups, Physical Colorado, Indivisible, the Women's Foundation of Colorado, and talk about getting involved with them and being part of them. That's a big piece too. We don't deal with any countries in the United States, but we still do with other countries. And so in my chapter meetings, I want to talk about other countries. What laws do we have? What do we have in democracy that they don't have? What can we do to retain that? And what can we do to reinforce it? What laws should we be having? What should we be doing to reinforce our democracy and improve it? And how can we do that?
I love this. So I'm hearing this both as you're going to use this as a launch pad for people to plug into other organizations, as well as using it as a reflective conversational tool to think about what are the pieces of a multiracial democracy that we're not yet seeing.
And are we happy with what we have? I don't think so.
Totally. All right, Kelsey, what are you thinking?
So one of the things that I'm sitting with, hearing all of these amazing commitments, good job, everyone. We have a little bit of time. We have 9 minutes. And I'm curious about if any of you feel like you've made these commitments and you're like, okay, I'm excited to do this, but here's a challenge I fully expect to have, right? Like here are the 5 members that we have this relationship, it's been tense, or we've talked about this before, or I've tried to bring things back to my group. What are challenges that y'all are anticipating? We have a lot of wisdom in the room, both from our facilitators, but also from each of you. And this could be a great time to troubleshoot. And if y'all are like, no, I got this, I don't see any challenges, we can always end a little early too, but.
What I will say is I don't think that there's been a lot of talk about democracy and the fact that it's not, is it strong? Is it weak? What are we doing? I don't think we talk about it in general or in our meetings at all. It's not a subject that we kind of push it to the side. We don't like it, but we don't talk about it. Is my take on it.
That's very real. And I think to that, Betty, I can speak to this as the coordinator for this season. And I think some of you already heard this story because I shared it at the first session is, you say democracy, and for so many of us, the response we get is, right? We feel that stress. We feel the ick. And there's a reason why, because we saw the numbers up front, right? And so I think, finding those supports in the people who are willing to say, hey, I maybe don't want to talk about this, but if we couch it in this, then maybe I can talk about it, right?
And we need to make sure we don't get into this is political. I mean, we don't start talking about our political views. That's the key,
I can
in
definitely
my opinion,
see, yeah, I can see starting there, and then, eventually it may lead to
because
the
it will.
whole discussion. Drew, I see your hand up.
So, Betty, thank you for that sort of interesting like plug about like it not sort of being political, because I think that the challenge for us is going to be the issue around, sort of partisanship, right? Like, I mean, I want to say I think that, most folks who are part of our group, I mean, I think we're all partisan. Like we never say nonpartisan or bipartisan. I think for the most part we're kind of like, all one thing, right? Which I won't say what that thing is, but I guess I'm honestly like when sort of like, what is this space? Like how, like, I think when you see me, like I'm a walking, screaming, Democrat, right? Like when you see me, you know that, like, I mean, look at me, right? And I guess I just wonder sort of like, I think that will be kind of like the friction, because I think we've had 2 or 3 times when like someone said, oh, like we should support person X. And before like we could even examine the great thing that person did, like the response is, well, he's a thing. And I'm like, oh yeah, I never thought of that. And I'm assuming that that's probably going to be a part of the large friction. Like, are we supporting folks who are supporting this agenda for democracy? Or are we supporting folks because they're on, this team or that team? I think that's going to be the struggle.
Yep, I do too.
I think that is a really great point. And one resource that I would encourage you all to check and like start looking into, spoiler alert, we're hoping to do a training on it next year, so get excited. It's called deep canvassing, and it's predominantly rooted in electoral work, but its model in itself is really applicable to our everyday lives. And so essentially, I'm going to do my best to explain it. Full disclosure, I'm not an expert, but I did work on a campaign that used this tactic. We know that partisanship, it partially happens, right? Because it's easy to say yes to something. It's easy to have that little check mark and say, yep, I see the R, I see the D, or I see the I. I know that I'm going to vote for this person. I don't even have to think about it, right? But many of these issues that we are grappling with right now as a nation, they are heart issues. They're rooted in places like fear to not be able to provide for your family, or fear of being unsafe in your own communities. And so starting from that heart place, instead of the data and numbers and being like, but this, and just sharing personal stories, right? Grounding it in that personal piece, which inherently is political, to your point, Drew. But rather than leaning in saying, I'm a Democrat and I think we should go for this because of this, right? You start to tell the story of why you think we should support X. And so, for example, the campaign that I worked on, we were in Massachusetts. We were trying to uphold transgender rights. And we knew that as a state, we were being used as a test case. Most people hear Massachusetts, they're like, oh yeah, obviously you're going to win that ballot initiative. But it wasn't guaranteed. There were a lot of moments that the polling really was showing it being very close. And rather than just going on the doors and saying, hey, vote yes because we told you to, instead, what we did was ask things like, have you ever met a trans person before? Yes, no, right? For those who felt comfortable and safe with the person they were talking with, they could say something like, well, you can say that you did meet someone today because I identify as trans, and here's my story and why this ballot initiative matters to me. Or I have a very good friend who's trans, and the reason why I'm volunteering on this ballot initiative is XYZ. And really putting that human face to these issues rather than leaning into that piece of like, here's the history of how we did this, or here's the data points. That's what moves people, right? We even talk about this in our giving circle training, where it's like, if I walk up to you, Drew, and I say, hey, will you join my giving circle? You're probably going to be like, I don't know who you are. I have my kid who's skateboarding in the yard. I need to make sure that they don't break their leg. I don't have time to join another giving circle. But if I were to come up to you and say, hey, Drew, I know that you really care about your child having fresh air to breathe and play in, and that you want your community to be thriving. I'm starting a giving circle where we're supporting groups that are doing climate justice work to ensure that all kids have the right to clean air. You're a lot more likely to say, okay, my schedule's a little packed, but like maybe I'll find a way to do it, right? And it's that heart story is how we can start making those shifts as a team and as a community. Knowing that we have 1 minute left, anybody want to add something? Okay, hearing none. The biggest thank you to Kyson and Haley, and thank you, all of you, for coming on this journey and adventure. When I proposed this to Kyson and Haley, I told them from jump, I was like, this is an experiment. We'll see how it goes. We'll see how it's received. So the one thing I would ask of each of you, if you would be so kind, we would really love to hear your feedback on this session. I'm going to drop a link in the chat. Thank you all for sticking with us till the end. But we would love your feedback. You know, did this land with you? Was it helpful? What do you want more of? What do you want less of? Fill that form out. Let us know. That input that you all give directly informs how I move in the future, who I bring in, all of that good stuff. But with that, we're going to end our session today. And I am so grateful for the work that I know that all of you are going to go out and do. Go change the world, y'all.
And eat some sweet Halloween candy. You know, you all deserve it.
Get all the treats, none of the tricks.